twilight hours, voices sing tales of hope and heartbreak.
Hello,
Every
everyone. Welcome to Our Stories, Our Members. This is episode number 6 with the one and only Dr. Gwen Moore. Thanks for joining us today, Gwen. We really appreciate it.
Delighted to be here, Ryan. Delighted to share my story. And yeah, looking forward to our chat.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the first question that I ask everyone, because I find it really fascinating, and I think the listeners do too, or the watchers, how did you get started in music?
So I suppose my story is quite interesting in that I grew up learning piano. I started learning piano at the age of 8, and wanted to give it up at the age of 11. I absolutely hated it. I hated the lessons. Um, and I just found it, yeah, very, very tedious. But interestingly enough, I come from a family of popular musicians. So my parents were separated, and essentially, my dad's side of the family, they're all really successful popular musicians. They play guitar, mostly guitarists, bass guitarists, musical arrangers, and musical directors. And so for me, what was really interesting about this was living with my mom and doing piano. It didn't. It should come as no surprise that by the age of 11, I was saying, "Look, piano is not for me. Please, can I get a guitar?" So, I started learning the guitar. My dad bought me my first guitar for my 12th birthday. So in a sense, I was kind of a late starter, and then it just took off from there. So I suppose I was inspired by the fact that on my dad's side, they had been performing successfully. For example, my cousin plays with Van Morrison, and there's a huge kind of tradition there of engaging in popular music. But interestingly enough, none of them had received formal lessons per se on that instrument, including my dad. And so, from that point of view, I was really curious all the way along as to how come I got lessons in guitar. I ended up doing classical guitar because I wanted to study music in university. And the only way I could do that at the time here in Ireland was to do all my grades. So I was late. So I kind of skipped grades to get ahead in terms of the level I could reach. And then do music in secondary school as a subject, and then audition for music in university. So it was a bit of a mad dash and a rush to get that far. But I was always enthralled and interested in how people come to learn music and their musical backgrounds. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. And I suppose from there, I kept obviously developing my guitar skills. But I must say, being the only girl in my family, the only female who learned guitar, and the only classically trained musician in the family, I suppose, in a sense, I felt a little bit at a disadvantage when it comes to ear playing, improvising, jamming. And that's how I did set aside time in more recent years to learn jazz and blues and try and upskill that way.
And it's interesting. I think there's always that one point that it's like a breaking point for a musician. I remember for me taking trumpet lessons, I didn't have a community of music or parents that were into music. So my music experience was more formal. And I remember taking my first series of trumpet lessons, and I wanted to quit so bad. And this is me in whatever age I was, 25 at the time. No, I'm just kidding. I was like 9 or 10 or whatever it was. And just crying from the lessons. And what kept me in was that my parents were still paying for my trumpet. And it was like, here's your monetary incentive that you need to stay in music in order to do this. And I was like, okay. And then you sort of grow into it and keep going. And I think for many students, they have that sort of experience. And unfortunately, instead of shifting or finding a different instrument or sticking with it, they tend to quit. They tend to, as soon as there's that point of resistance for whatever reason, they tend to back away. And I think that becomes it's hard to say. It becomes detrimental, I guess, to later people. But I'm really interested in your background of this sort of being born into these informal music makers, this community music, and then,
Mhm.
pivoting to formal music education. It probably gives you a different viewpoint on how you interact with your students and those sorts of things. I find many of the classes that I teach now, one of the classes is music appreciation, just a general education course, non-music majors, very little experience in music. but I'm all about making music with them. Like when you appreciate something, you're doing it and just making that music and getting them into it. And there's almost like the shock of them beginning to make music because it was always like pushed aside in this dynamic of like, oh, well, we have to do this in a formal setting. But so much of music happens and it should happen in an informal setting. So do you engage with your students differently because of your background, do you think, than some of your colleagues? Or
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah.
So I work in initial teacher education or pre-service teacher education. And so what I find here in Ireland, we have really rich culture of Irish traditional music, but also a lot of the students that come to do primary or elementary teaching, they often come with backgrounds where they're bi-musical. They can play a bit of classical and also traditional. And that for me is really interesting because they often have already learned to play by ear. And so, with that interest in mind, I launched Musical Futures and piloted for the first time in Ireland in 2016. And so, and researched that as well. But I mean, I'm really passionate about informal learning. And I suppose that the practices of popular music in my teaching with initial teacher education students, regardless of whether they've played or not. And that's often a case because they're generalist teachers. So some of them don't have much musical experience while others will come with extensive. So even we have cohorts of 400 students in each year. And at some point in time, they're all engaging in, ear playing at some level. And then in more elective specialist modules, for example, we have one in instrumental music leadership. We're trying to, I guess, enhance that by making sure that they have a range of experiences, but they also get to do a lot of improvising and composing in groups, similar to Lucy Green's approach.
Yeah, breaking down those walls becomes so important. I know just learning from my perspective as in this formal setting, like the side of like improvising ear training, playing by ear was almost unheard of because within your very first lesson, you sit down with a book in front of you and you're learning how to read and you're just playing exactly what's on that page. And then later in life, when we try to introduce those skills, it often becomes such a thing of fear for students that, oh, I have to improvise. I have to, where's the music? What, I can't do this without the music. And so much of musical history doesn't rely on written notation at all. But for some reason, we've gravitated toward that as being the main experience. And the other thing I was thinking about is fascinating from my perspective. When I teach music in general, we talk mostly about genres of music. So it might be something, hip hop related, or it might be rock, or it might be early rock and roll. These things that come into that 20th century and beyond space, where I can't really point back to the music of that culture per se, because the United States is such an amalgamation of different traditions and different ethnicities that come into that space. It's when I look at my class and I see this person's from this area or that area, or this has this background and that background. It's very different perspective, I think, on having to teach. And then there's also this huge variety of music that they listen to. I think many times they get pigeonholed into the idea of, oh, I only listen to Taylor Swift, or I'm only listening to what's in the top 40 or the top 100. But meanwhile, you dive into their backgrounds and they're listening to a wealth of music, which they often don't know why they've chosen those songs and trying to make those connections. But they bring all of that mix. It's a big melting pot of music that comes into it. So it must be good in a sense to look back and say, here's our traditional music. Here's what sort of makes Ireland Ireland, and this is how it arose. I find that perspective really interesting because we often can't teach from that perspective. We talked a little bit about what you do. So what's your current role now at the university?
Yeah, so I'm associate professor of music education here at Mary Immaculate College. And so my role, as I mentioned earlier on, is to work in initial teacher education. I'm engaged in research. Although, interestingly enough, my background is actually as a secondary level teacher, for subject specialists. So that's an interesting one for me from the point of view of trying to persuade generous teachers that they are musical, that they have musical capacity and aptitude, and they can teach music. They don't need to be that sage on the stage, as it were, that expert. And so, yeah, from that point of view, that's where I'm working at the moment, and that's my role. As you probably know, I'm also working in a range of different roles that involve editing and researching and writing too.
We have a similar thing in the United States where we have teachers or students that are going to like a general education program, and especially elementary education, and then we have to introduce musical skills for them to be able to push into the classroom. And you can imagine there's quite a bit of resistance in that space from the students. Either they feel like they shouldn't be bothered doing it, or they can't do it. There's always some sort of level of, and sometimes it's just a fear. It's just a fear of like, I'm going to be bad at something. And because what they forget is you were always bad at something. You know, when you started off, you were bad at something. There's very few things where you're like, I'm amazing at this right away. And so breaking down that sort of a level of fear into it. But I think it speaks as I talk to different people around the world. In the United States, it's very much separate. So we have our music certification, and in some states it's a K through 12 music certification. Sometimes it's broken up into vocal and instrumental, into specialties and various subsets of that. And in elementary music education, the students will go to a music class. And in some cases, it got forgotten about as being part of the regular education process. Because I remember back to the last century when I went to elementary school or primary school, and we had pianos in the rooms, and the teachers would often play little songs on the pianos or have a sing along, or that was integrated right within that framework. And we've sort of separated it out, almost like church and state in the US. You know, we've sort of separated this out. And I think there's this idea of, oh, that's for the music teacher to do, or that's not what we do. Plus, along with that formalized fear, or I don't have the training into it. Um, yeah, I think that's fascinating. So, is there a certification process for music teachers in Ireland, or is it, uh, like general education and you take elective courses? How does that?
Yeah. So it depends. If you're going to teach in a primary school, you just do a Bachelor of Education, and within that program, or you could do what's called a consecutive program. It's a 2-year master's to qualify as a generalist primary teacher. And within that, there will be music within arts education modules, but there isn't a separate certificate required for that. Whereas at secondary level, high school, middle school, that's where you do require specialist a qualification that is ratified by the teaching council. So both of those degrees come under the remit of the teaching council accreditation. But what's interesting is that the generalist teacher is, I guess, charged with teaching all of the curriculum. Now, schools in Ireland will often have, sometimes they'll have budgets for specialist teachers or artists to come into schools. Um, and in some cases, there may be teachers in a school who their strength lies with music, and another teacher in that school, their strengths are in physical education. And so they might agree, look, you take my class for PE and I'll take yours along with mine for music, so it differs. It's very different. And I suppose coming back to your point about specialism, specialist teachers, I think there's a place for that. The downside, I suppose, is that a lot of the specialist teachers might not necessarily get to know all of the children at primary level because they're seeing so many. And whereas the generalist teacher knows their class, they get to know them, they have built relationships, they've built rapport. But it's that they're often so busy trying to teach what we call the core. As you know, literacy and numeracy and STEM is really big right now. And so ultimately, music and the arts tends to be sidelined or tends to suffer. And of course, if the teacher doesn't feel confident teaching it, well, it just gets abandoned sometimes. So I guess there's quite a smorgasbord of practice here in Ireland. It's very hard to specify, but to answer your initial question, there isn't a requirement for teachers to have a specific certification in music at primary level.
And one of the downsides I see in the US is that many of the programs, I'm probably going to offend some programs here and make other ones smile, but many of the programs just create more of the same. And what I mean by that is that, music practice has changed and music consumption has changed immensely over the last 50 years. But because the university systems become so rooted in this practice, it just cycles on the same band, choir, orchestra, band, choir, orchestra, band, choir, orchestra. Meanwhile, for us, the demographics of our cities have changed greatly. The rotation of music systems have changed greatly, and therefore the music teacher oftentimes that gets churned out isn't capable of handling a more modern setting because they're still in what we were in 1950 or 1960, which still exists in pockets in the US and suburbia and those communities that have that. So there becomes almost this like two-sided thing of like, here's our traditional musics, and then here's like, oh, the modern music. And it almost pits one against the other. And some of the best school systems I've
Mm.
worked with have been ones that have been able to incorporate both and be open to those. Because a lot of times the traditional systems of, I take instrumental lessons, it just doesn't work in a city setting. When you're looking at New York City and you have 1,000 music teachers, like how do you have any consistency and schools of choice
Yeah.
and all this kind of stuff that plays into it? And I have also seen what you mentioned is that you have the specialist in music that then they only see the kids maybe once a week. It's a full rotation of
Mm.
the 500 kids that are in the school. There's just no way that you're going to learn their names or build any kind of rapport with them. And what
Yeah.
else also happens here is that many times the music or the arts electives or what have you will become the break or the preparation period for the core teacher. So they're just viewed as like, oh, we're pushing the kids off on you so
Oh
we
yeah.
can get a break. So that comes up quite a bit. And I'm really fascinated by between the different systems. Lejuan, who I had on episode 3 or 4, um, three, I think, she had taught in
Mm.
the Boston public school area, the Boston area in public school, and also taught in China. And just a fascinating conversation between a very like we have standards, but we necessarily, because of the function of what we call LEAs, which are local education agencies or school districts, and then we have the state, and then we have federal government, and then you have China. So
Mm.
ours is very diffuse, but China is very rigorous, and all the teachers teach the exact same curriculum within that structure. So, she was talking about here you get all the resources in China, but you have no flexibility. And in the US, you have a tremendous amount of flexibility, but many times limited resources to apply the different things. So yeah, I think it becomes interesting to look at the different aspects across the world, and then what are the outcomes for the students as we move through. But yeah, it's fascinating. So with all these roles that you have right
Mm.
now, I always found that music, I'll label them as people, but music people have this passion project they're working on. Like there's something they really want to dive into, and I assume that you have one as well.
Yeah, I've always been interested in, you mentioned there about, band and orchestra and so on being the mainstay in the US. And I suppose in Ireland, because it's been quite organic, shall we say, and it's also very inconsistent. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But what it does mean is that there are great pockets of inequality in terms of access to music education. So that has been a huge passion project of mine. When I did my PhD, I was looking at, why do only some students get into study at university music like I was?
Mhm.
What are the hoops they have to go through, and who doesn't get there, and who is not successful, and how does that present challenges for teaching and learning? But then also in schools, if we break that down to, well, if teachers are only going to be, let's say, middle class um, and well off because they've come through that system, what happens when they go out to schools? And a little bit like what you said in the US, you've got that social reproduction of practice, but also musical value, what gets valued, so if it's classical music. But in Ireland, what's interesting is that at the secondary level, which is really the access point to university, so when you finish your secondary level schooling, you're then applying to go to college. And in Ireland, secondary level access to music as a subject is quite a mixed bag. So there are some schools that just don't offer it. And those schools would tend to be mostly boys' schools, which again reveals issues around gender and access to music education. So I'm very passionate about unpacking that, what is going on. And so my latest project, which is ongoing for at least a year now, I'm doing a national study of music provision and participation at secondary level. And it's from the perspective of teachers. Now, what's really interesting about this, Ryan, is, perhaps in other jurisdictions like the US or the UK, there'll be a sort of a slate, or there'll be a database of music teachers available that your sample is 10,000 teachers or 5,000 teachers that are registered to teach music. In Ireland, we don't have that, right? So even from a starting point to figure out who is the population I'm looking at here, what numbers are we talking about? I could see that a certain amount of teachers were registered with the Teaching Council and qualified to teach music, but that doesn't mean they're all actually working in schools.
Mhm.
So from the starting point, it's really difficult. The data, they're just not there. And so what I've had to do is to try and ascertain through Department of Education statistics, which schools are offering music, which schools don't, and how many students are presenting for examination. So that has been really interesting because what teachers have been telling me is that in some schools there is an increase in students electing to study music, where it's a strong culture of music in the school, and in other schools where they're competing with new subjects, students are dropping off and there's a decline. So from that point of view, it's ongoing to say the least. So I have interviewed 14 teachers and I've done a survey, national survey of teachers, and I'm going through the process of all of that data analysis. But suffice to say that that's why I'm so interested in it, because I think if students don't find their passion at secondary level, sometimes that's it. It's very difficult. We often hear, I know for me, I was late. It was 12 when I picked up the guitar. And then I went, well, I got to do music in school. But then I was told, well, if you're going to get to university, you need to get to this grade to get in. So it was a mad dash to try and get up to that level of requirement before I could. Now, things have relaxed somewhat. And what's wonderful in Ireland is at the senior cycle of secondary schooling, kind of like your SATs, students can play any genre of music and they can perform as part of a group or as a solo or in duets. And so, from that point of view, it's very inclusive. But despite all of that, it's a mixed bag in terms of how many schools are offering the subject. So in a way, even if you do open the doors to make it more inclusive, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be valued, by those who well, it depends on subjects. If a parent is saying, well, look, you got a choice between physics, biology, and music, you got to do biology or physics. It depends who's calling the shots on the subject choice. And the other thing that's really important is in almost 99% of the schools, music is not compulsory in the first year of secondary schooling. So unlike other jurisdictions where all students get a kind of have to do a taster in a subject for at least a year or longer, in Ireland, it's not the case. Sometimes they have to pick their subjects before they go to school. And then in some cases, it's a carousel, a taster of subjects. So therefore, they might get 4 weeks and then they have to pick whichever one they like the most. So the teacher is doing their best to sell the subject in as, this is a great subject, come and do it. And so that puts a huge strain on teachers to try and, entice students into music. Yeah. So that's what I'm working on at the minute. Yeah, it's challenging.
Yeah, I would imagine. I've been fortunate to do data work for some large cities in the US regarding their music programs. And even with data collection points in place, so all schools obviously have robust data systems. We know that in most states that music courses are being taught by certified music teachers and then labeled as such, but different because of how we're formed, different districts could have, you know, say 50 different types of music courses that they offer. And we know they're taught by, music theory one and chorus and band and modern band, whatever it is. And then they have to report up to the state. Well, the state for categories may only have four options. So now there's some poor administrative person somewhere trying to figure out what this means for, in Pennsylvania, for example, one of the areas that I've done quite a bit of work in, there's nearly 500 school systems and they're allowed to pass. You can pass whatever
Wow.
courses that you want under that. Now the state has to figure out where all those courses are supposed to go, and then that gets reported up to the federal government, even fewer categories generally, but it becomes like how they're classified and how that gets into the different specs, but you can't tell duration many times. And what we have is just what you stated is they'll say music education might be compulsory for certain grade levels, but they often don't say how much. So
Mhm.
is 1 week enough? Is it 4 weeks? So then it becomes dependent upon the school system and the resources, and then it's determined by the administration at the district level of how important music is and how it. So it's not, even though it may seem equal, it's not all equal across the board. But the data is there. It's just many times um, school districts just simply don't have the resources to figure out what's working and what's not working and where they're applying those funds and those kind of things. But it can be very, very complex when you're looking at all those subsets times the number of students times the number of teachers and all those fun things to work around. So now let's step into the ISME side of things and tell me about your first
Yeah.
experience with ISME. Unless it's really bad, then don't tell me about it and tell me
Oh.
a good one.
No, it was wonderful. So I remember my first experience with ISME was I attended the ISME World Conference in Bologna in 2008. So I started in academia in 2006, and that was my first ISME conference. And this is so funny because I will never forget, I had had a baby in 2007, my youngest. And so this was my first trip away from my kids for a full week in Bologna. But I will never forget that I just remember thinking this was huge. And I had been to conferences, I'd been to RIME, the UK, and conferences in Ireland. This was my first big world conference. And I remember, I think I still have the tome of the actual, the program and the abstracts, it was about that thick. It was huge. So yeah, I will always forget that was my first encounter with ISME. And I did remember gravitating towards anyone I could find who was from Ireland, like who do I know who I might actually meet here? And then being introduced by, for example, Mary McCarthy, who is Irish, and I knew Mary, and so it was kind of Mary then introducing me to other ISME members from across the world. So that was my first encounter, and it was fantastic.
Yeah, it's amazing when you go to the conference and regardless of nationality, you have this bond of just being in music, right? And you can talk about music or you connect, and it just seems very natural and organic. And I've had unfortunate circumstances where I've had to go to non-music conferences, and they're not the same. They're definitely not the same as how people interact and how people talk and the passion that you see behind everything. So that was a while ago. We're going back about, I'm not trying to age you at all, Gwen,
Yes.
but we're going back about we're all going in that direction, right? But the that's going back about 17 years at this point, and
Yeah.
you stayed with ISME for some reason. I think sometimes as I'm wrapping my mind around people's involvement in ISME, and one of the things I think so important about podcasts like this is just sort of understanding people's roles and why they stay with certain things. When I first started talking about people informally about ISME, uh, many people said, "Oh, I just go to the conference, I get it on my resume or my CV, whatever, and then it looks good on that." And for me, when I hear that, it seems, and I'm not trying to be insulting, but it seems short-sighted or maybe like a younger person's
Mm.
view of what music is. And I just know being in the music, I'm going to age myself a little bit here too, being in the music space for, you know, wow, almost 30 years now in different capacities, like all from teaching at college to nonprofits and teaching public school. It's a small world. It's a very, very small world. And those connections
Mhm.
that you find have served me a lifetime. There's people that I'm connected with that I first started teaching with. I have students that are doing, former students that are doing like heavy work in song labels right now and song editing. And like all those connections come to play. And I think sometimes people come to ISME and like, I get it here and then I'm done. And then I don't know if they're trying to restart, but why did you stick with ISME for so long? Why didn't you just, you have a small child at home or had a small child at home, now a big child. And like,
And
why didn't you just dump it?
yeah.
Be done with it. Yeah.
No, for me it was the beginnings of I just said kind of sound cheesy now, but it did feel like the beginnings of the starting of getting to know a very large community slash family of music makers and musicians and researchers. So if I can fast forward to 2016, I will never forget that conference in Glasgow in particular. And for me, that was a real sense of how would you say everything coming together in terms of networking, building a sense of community. I also will never forget, the keynotes, Evelyn Glennie and Joan Armatrading talking about the stuff that resonated so strongly with me, which was, music as participation and encounter, and not forcing things on children. That discovering music. But for me as well, that was the first time that I was a chair of our national society here for music education, and it was the first time that the ISME National Affiliate Association, or INA group, came together. Um, and apart from that, it was the largest contingent of Irish people. Not surprisingly, because it was in Scotland, right, geographically very close to us. But I just remember that it branched out for me a huge network of music makers and teachers and scholars from across the world. So, you know, continents. And so it was really mind blowing to get to know so many people through that, which is now obviously our COPA, Council of Professional Associations. And that was a real turning point, because I began to have this sense of, wow, this network. I thought it was so far reaching many years prior to that. And then I realized, actually, this is much closer than one would think. Um, and we have a lot in common. We respect each other's differences, but we also have quite a lot of common challenges and issues that we're talking about at various levels within our different countries and our different practice areas. So it's sort of turbocharged, shall I say. So for me, that turbocharged feeling that this was much bigger than I had ever imagined. So that was huge. And I suppose from there, it just grew. So that for me was kind of the most pivotal moment, was that 2016, which is nearly 10 years ago now.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, the idea of like this family connection and connecting with people and the commonalities. And one of the things that struck me is that I've worked with a few different organizations, and music people, at least in my my rose-colored glasses opinion, is that they're just amazing. They're really good people. They care about their students. They want to see the best out there. And we have so much to learn. And those learning moments come in different times. And the one that comes up for me is I was on a call with Julie Ballantyne, who's one of our board members from Australia. And we were on a call. I don't even remember what the call was about, but I remember she had these two products in the back. And I was like, Julie, what are those? And she's like, oh, I use this thing to teach songwriting. And this is called Orba to do this. And immediately I was like fascinated by that. And I used that similar thing when I'm teaching songwriting in song form now. And the call, I don't even know what it was about, but I just got that. I saw that idea and I was like, that's an amazing idea. And I think sometimes those little light bulb moments come when we're least expecting them. And but that's why I'm interested in on why people stay around, and your involvement has increased. You're first of all, you're
Yeah.
super busy. You have the family, you have the job, and then you decide like I'm going to get involved with the publications committee and take on the next level of
Mm.
of craziness in in your own work life. So what made you decide to get more involved with that?
Again, it was that sense of, I suppose, feeling that you can learn a lot. A lot of that is, realizing I can learn a lot, but also I have a lot to contribute. And it's, so in a sense, yes, it's service, we could call it, that is service to the broader community, but it is also a form of professional development, and I think that for academics, but also teachers in general, that is so important to realize that you still have so much to learn from others. Um, and whether that's, informally or formally, through the World Conference. So that was really important to me. And I had also being part of the editorial board of IJME from 2016. So I'd already gotten well involved before, being elected to the board in 2020. So I was really, I suppose, heavily invested from that point of view, because I really felt that there's so much that you can give, but you can also learn from being part of the publications, but also the practice, learning from others and being inspired by people who have done this as well, particularly. And I know I'm going back to Mary McCarthy, but because, again, as an honorary member of ISME, there's a lot of inspiration you can draw from somebody who has also come from a similar jurisdiction and has also learned a huge amount and given immense time to ISME.
Yeah, I think maybe some of it too, and maybe I'm projecting, but some of it too might be the thinking people that think, I'm trying to phrase this correctly, people that think less of themselves in a way. Like, what do I have to contribute? Or what can I
Yeah.
do to be able to do this? I remember the first time that I was asked to conduct a college wind ensemble when I was a student. And I was like, these are my peers. Who am I to tell these people what to do? And then all of a sudden you're like, okay, I'm also in learning mode. I'm learning, I'm practicing how to do this. And I would
Mhm.
echo that too. Even in my role as CEO, I think there's certain skills and certain abilities that you bring to the role, but I've also learned a lot from the different members. And I've learned a lot about how people interact and, where the gaps are in knowledge or for the board or for myself or for the organization, and trying to identify those and bringing in sort of different skill sets to be able to make that happen. And I think sometimes we're just afraid to do that. We're afraid to just say, hey, I'm in learning mode and it's okay if I don't know this. We're all working on the same
Yeah.
team. We all want this together in a very sort of global sense. But the truly honored work of the publications committee, both with the journal and the book series and all those things that contribute to it. It's sometimes I feel it's like a thankless job at times because of the level of detail that you have to go into. I'm very thankful for people like you that take that on, because there's no way I would want to do that and have to read to that level of detail and go back and forth and edits. But I know people that have submitted for the journal, and they're always appreciative of the comments and the feedback. And the journal has made tremendous strides over the last 4 to 6 years or something like that, and has gradually increased in popularity and been cited more and more and more. And so obviously great work throughout that. um yeah, it's always so interesting to see how our careers develop over a period of time. So if you had to take a step back and go back a
Mm.
few decades, what sort of advice would you give to people that are looking into getting into like your role, teaching, like in general? Like what would you tell them?
Oh, I think,
Don't do it. No,
well,
I'm just
I no, do you know what? I think that the first thing is it's find your passion. Find your if your
Yep.
passion is inspiring others, um, you know, finding out more information, whatever, follow that passion, follow that drive. And the other thing that you mentioned there is, that fear, the fear of I won't know enough or I won't be able. And it's to have the courage to know that, nobody comes with all of this knowledge inbuilt already. It is a slow burner, and it's something that you gradually come to know over time. But we are better for the networking that we have. And so ultimately, it's to reach out and ask for mentoring. I think that's a huge element of it. I've been really involved in that in the last 5 to 10 years around, mentoring colleagues, mentoring students, but also, people who think that imposter syndrome thing that happens and thinking we all have that. Even, the most advanced scholars will still have imposter syndrome at some point. But, it's having the courage to realize I can do this. In fact, I probably could lead it if I was able to be given the chance. And so it's to have that faith and courage in your ability, but also I think the drive to want to make a change. And if you want to make a change, deep down, it will happen. But I do think that the power is in the the feedback and the mentoring and the discussion you can have with your peers, with colleagues, and that networking. So it is almost like a web, that's how I kind of picture it in my mind. It's a web of connections that lead you down different paths and that can guide you different ways. And it is people that that are most and relationships that build these opportunities, in my view. So for me, ISME is a perfect starting point because you can find a group, whether it's through the student um, forum, or whether it's through another forum. You can find that pathway and make a difference. So yeah, that would be my advice. Passion, courage, and just go for it.
Well, and that's so great. And that other people have mentioned passion as well. And my comment back is that sometimes passions can hide themselves or mask themselves.
Mm.
And you have to like I would have said, oh my, I guess my passion would have been not necessarily music, but trumpet playing at one point. And then when I started working with students, it was like, oh, my passion is teaching or inspiring students. But then when I kept boiling
Mm.
it down to after teaching for a while, I got really bored and I realized my passion was actually building things. It was like building programs or building like, and that's
Mm.
so it can mask and change and be open to that. And I think I would tack on to, and you mentioned it briefly, is just take these opportunities. When you see an opportunity or you think you might, like you mentioned the student forum of saying like, oh, that's something I might want to be involved with. Get involved, do it. What are you
Mm.
going to be out? What are you going to be out of turning that down and try not to turn down those opportunities that lead to those connections? We often get maybe this isn't in Ireland, but we hear this a lot. When am I going to need to know this when you're teaching? When am I going
Okay.
to need to know this, right? And it's a false question because you can't answer it. And it's the same
Mm.
with connections. When are you going to need that connection? Well, when am I going to need that connection? But the more connections you have, the more knowledge you have, the more better off you are in life. And I've been fortunate to meet a lot of great people along my journey, like you. And I want to thank you for joining us today on our number 6 episode of Our Stories, Our Members, the one and only. As I said in the beginning, but if you made it this far, isme@isme.org. Drop me a line. I'll send you something. Uh, People are going to start skipping to the end at this point. But thank you so much for being on. Really appreciate it. It was great, great having you.
Any pleasure.